Thanks, Lisa.
Because it runs through all, I think, of business. Even if your job at the time is being a student, it kind of runs through everything. I think the more that we've looked at this issue, whether you work in a law firm or a corporation, whether you're a student, thinking about mental health and wellness and being intentional about so many of those things that Ed just mentioned on this slide, it's really it's really integral to success. And I say that as someone who used to kind of blow off a lot of this stuff and not really think about it. So my name is Mike Kasdan. I'm a partner at Wigan and Dana. I also do intellectual property law. That's a common theme among our three speakers here today. So I do patent stuff. I also do some adjunct professoring like Ed. So and I'm fortunate to have met Ed through someone in my network who said, hey, there's this other guy that does patent law and does some professor work and talks about mental health. Do you know him? And I didn't. And so I'm happy to be doing this together. And Ed's kind of like the Southern bearded, more handsome version of me in some senses. And Lisa, I'm also, so happy to meet. We met through Autumn. Lisa and I have a podcast that we just started called the Inclusion Revolution, where we talk about DEI, but also spend a lot of time talking about mental health because these issues all intersect. And we are putting this on just the three of us. There's no organization, just as part of, trying to contribute more to the conversation and sort of cover some ground because I think all of us feel very strongly about it. So in my comments, I want to cover kind of four things. One, the problem. What are we talking about here? But not just focusing on the problem, like mental health, it's a problem, the statistics are terrible, there's stigma, it's terrible. I also want to talk about the solution. So first, so this is one of the problem slides, so we'll talk about this. But talk about the problem, talk about why the problem exists, perhaps, and there are lots of theories about it, but why specifically the legal field, even starting in law school and going all the way through to practice, whether you practice in big law or you're a solo practitioner or you're in-house, it's high on the list that folks don't want to be on, that none of us want to be on, of people who struggle with mental health and wellness and high incidences of depression and anxiety and other clinical issues, but also people. I read something today and I bristled a little bit at it, but there's an article in the Washington Post today, an opinion piece that said, if you want to be happy, don't be a lawyer. And I think that's really unfortunate. And I think that this brings me to kind of the solutions. So talking a little bit about the solutions, but talking about them both on kind of two levels. One is like an institutional level, right? Like what can we be doing structurally within these firms to change it? And then second, I want to also touch on the individual level. And I know, Ed just covered some of those individual techniques, but I think it's really important that we do it kind of on both those levels. So I think when you're talking about the problem, I joined Instagram basically to make sure my kids weren't getting into a lot of trouble there. And now I have an Instagram account for my little Lawyering While Human project. And there's some legal accounts that I follow. And I noticed that there's this consistent theme in their memes, right? So they're a little bit funny, but they're also a little bit cringy and scary. And these are just some of them, but there's a lot of talk about mental health, right? And I don't know who litigation God is, but I respect what he or she does. But I assume these are younger folks saying kind of, this is what life is like as a lawyer, right? Like I wake up Monday looking like that, and by Friday I feel like that. Or the one on the left is kind of a personal favorite of mine, right? The friend says, I feel like your personality is perfect for the law. And then this mouse with his hair staying on the edge, and he says, bro, thanks, it's actually a disorder, right? So there's a lot of talk about mental health and wellness and just kind of the status quo of like, we are not well, and that's just part of it. That's part of being a lawyer. And it's like, haha, get used to it and move on. So I just think looking at memes that have these little kernels of truth is a little bit of a different way of coming to the same conclusion as when we look at statistics. And of course, statistics are really important to look at too. And I don't want to spend a lot of time on these, but by now we have lots of studies that have been done over time. This one I picked from 2016 because that's pre-pandemic. The next slide will be post-pandemic. And I think the theme is that no matter where in time you're talking about, if you ask enough lawyers, you're going to get high incidences of these types of answers with, where it's higher than the general population in terms of suicidal thoughts, higher in terms of anxiety and depression. And this is back in 2016, an American Bar Association study. And this is in 2021, and some of these numbers are really high. So this is in the middle of the pandemic, but I think it's important to realize that these numbers, this is not a new thing. And I think any of us who are here, who are like, my age or or anywhere close, know it's not a new thing, because it's kind of always been this way. And some folks even wear it as a sort of badge of pride, right? That's what those memes are saying. They're like, this is what it means to be in big law. If you're working 23 hours and someone says, hey, do this, like you like happily run off and say, I do, and then collapse from exhaustion and do it again the next day. And when I first started speaking about this issue in the law, I was like this, and like Ed, I also have my own experience with mental health and well-being. I also took some time off back in 2021 for depression. Didn't talk about that for a good decade, as many people don't. But when I started lawyering while human, said like, look, this is not a sustainable model. I pushed back from my own family, like my brother and my sister, and they were like, but isn't that the deal? Like you go into big law and you make a bunch of money and you get stressed, and then you move on. And I don't think it has to be that way. And I think it's actually a better business model to do it a different way. And I wrote an article about that with Practical Law Company, with a great editor, Jessica Cherry, who did a lot of work on that piece too, that really says like, look, this goes through kind of every aspect of business, from recruiting to serving clients well, to retaining, to leading and making money. And just because we've done it for a long time, doesn't mean we're really doing it well. So I think there's a lot of reasons to improve. Now, why is there a problem? So there are lots of theories, but some of them I think look familiar, right? A lot of focus on the billable hour, working long hours, a lot of pressure to develop business without really teaching you too much about how to do that in law school, pressure to run a business when they don't really teach you too much about how to do that, in law school, client demands, being someone's agent, where folks think they might be hiring you to be their mercenary, when the real job is oftentimes creative problem solving. Competition, Ed touched on that, right? The difference between law school and grad school, where, in law school you have like these gunners, and it's not everyone, right? It's a generalization. But I remember a talk last year where people said, yeah, we feel like we're in competition with our colleagues because only a couple of us are going to make equity partner. And so it's, those, you see that adversarial nature of the job often. Some people think good lawyering is, yelling at the other side and fighting. And so that people have mentioned this lack of agency, right? You're someone else's agent, and how does that make you feel when? So that's an interesting one. And then this always on culture. I remember when BlackBerries came out, that little light went off. I was like the first to respond to the email, and I took pride in that. I was like, I'm responsive, I'm on it. But that's prized rather than maybe other things, and that's a choice. And then seeing vulnerability and help seeking as weakness. I'd mentioned that, and I see a lot of parallels between that and some of the masculinity work I've done with the Goodman Project. This feeling that asking for help is weakness when it's really kind of a strength. Other big picture takeaways. I think some of these sort of character traits may look familiar. And I think, these character traits sometimes get like inculcated into institutions, right? Like we're warriors, we're combative, we're competitive, we win no matter what, perfectionism, always on, these types of things we see. So this is, I think, just some of the reasons why, the culture of law gets us to this, culture of poor mental wellness traditionally. But I now want to kind of move on from like the problem and maybe why it arose to what we're talking about here, because I think some people look in the numbers and it's enough, right? Some people say, look, like 1 in 5 people in the US, 20% have a diagnosed clinical mental health issue, clinical anxiety, clinical depression. So that's a lot. 1 in 5 in any workplace, that's a whole bunch of folks. So it's obviously an important problem. But some people say like that just kind of others that one person, that makes them, they're like, there's 4 healthy people and there's that one person you got to like take care of. And that what's really more reflected in reality is that it's more like 9 in 10 or 9.9 in 10. And this is from the Accenture Workplace Wellbeing Report. And I think they said like, look, whether you're the person who's suffering an issue or you're that person's parent or that person's child, or you have a friend. Like if you talk about all the people who are either navigating mental health and well-being challenges or helping others in their network navigate it, you go from 1 in 5 way up to 9 in 10. And and I also think, and I'm sorry for the bell curve, don't worry, I'm not going to talk about math. But I think this is a little interesting because I think, again, when we talk about clinical issues, we may be talking about the tail of the bell curve. Like I'm talking about this 1 in 5 was this really acute situation on the one hand, or on the other hand, just the people who you're like, go do yoga and go to the gym and you never have a care in the world and it's great. And, I think we've all gone through cycles like that. But most people are in this kind of fat middle of the bell curve. And I'm not talking about people who are clinically depressed or have an acute thing like may have happened to myself or Ed. I'm just talking like every day you're navigating stress, like your mom's in the hospital, something happened to your kid at work, like you broke your leg, you have a really stressful relationship that you're managing, you have a stressful client that you're managing. Everyone is like riding that stress roller coaster every day. And so I think what we're talking about when we're talking about mental health and well-being is this broad conversation that I think spans from diagnosed clinical mental health issues and having an infrastructure that supports those people who are a large percentage of people when those issues come up, but also just everybody. So I think everybody is served by an infrastructure and a culture and individual practices that help us navigate these issues. And scary stat on the right that I saw, this guy, Sahil Bloom, tweeted out a whole bunch of really interesting graphs for who you spend time with at different points in your life, like your kids, kids and parents, coworkers. And I think we know this, but when you look at it, it's like, wow, you spend a lot of time for a long period of time with the people who are your coworkers. And very simply, like it's better if we treat each other well. Because there's also only one of us. I don't know if people saw the very scary Ben Stiller hit show Severance, about sort of severing your home being and your home mic and work mic. But that's kind of science fiction. And what the reality is that there's only one you, and what happens at home kind of affects you at work and vice versa. And so I think it's much better to kind of deal with this as like an integrated self kind of problem and just confront it and deal with it. And I think the pandemic, the silver lining of the pandemic was people being more open to this conversation about the problem. And I think now we need to like really push forward, on these solutions. So let me just be mindful of time. So just take just like 4 more minutes and then turn it over to Lisa. But the thing that we're talking about, and this was interesting to me, and if anyone wants the slides, I'm happy to. I think we're all happy to provide them. But being mentally well, like what you're shooting for, mental wellness, is not the opposite of mental illness. Like mental health, mental well-being is not just like not being mentally ill; it's thriving. And the World Health Organization and this is the National Task Force on Attorney Well-being adopted that definition of looking at how you're doing across these these different areas. Like are you intellectually satisfied? Are you getting exercise? Are you socially engaged? How are you doing emotionally? How are you doing spiritually? Whatever that means to you. And how are you doing at work, and looking at across these issues. And that's kind of what I was talking about with the integrated approach. So I mentioned in terms of solutions, kind of 2 levels. I think if we only talk about, hey, here's a technique you should use, you should go to yoga more, or you should meditate more, then I think that we're putting all of the onus of solving the problem on individuals. And I think a lot of those individuals may be in institutions where no matter how much yoga they do, they're still going to have a high amount of stress and anxiety and poor mental well-being. So I think it's really important that people say, like, this is actually an institutional, organizational, and cultural issue. And a couple things there, right? Like looking at the culture and looking at how we treat people, how we communicate, how we have meetings, how we send emails, things like that, I think is really, really important. And I think it's a leadership issue. And, I also have been spending a lot of time speaking to law students, and it's awesome that they're focused on this way more so than we were. And I think that what we need to do as leaders is embrace that, because that generation is coming, and they're smart and they care about this. And I think it is smart to care about this. And I think we need to build workplaces that they're going to thrive in. And I think it's a very old school belief, that like, oh, this is just being lazy. Like, it's not being lazy. Like, it's just, I think, working smarter, and it's just more real. I can think of a lot of times in my career, and I thought about this as I've transitioned from associate to partner, where I'd rather the associate say, oh, I can't get you that tonight. Is tomorrow okay? Because there's no real deadline. Tonight's my kid's birthday. Instead of what I did, which was say, like, when do you want it? Oh, in 2 hours? Okay, I'll stay late and do that and miss the kid's birthday, and then accumulate unhappiness about that over time and then leave very quickly. So I think we can build a better world where everyone makes plenty of money and serves clients plenty well, and also sort of is balanced. So that's what I'm talking about. I think a lot of people look at these buzzwords like authenticity and humanity, and kind of, it gets lost because it's so buzzy. But I think these words have real meaning. And I think you can go from what this means as a leader, and say, okay, how am I communicating to people? Am I checking in with people? What are my expectations? Am I managing people right? What's our team environment like? Because I think you want an atmosphere where people are fine saying, look, I'm struggling for this because this thing is happening in my life. Can we shift some resources to cover it, rather than pushing through, doing subpar work, getting angry and leaving? We talked about kind of viewing, vulnerability as weakness. I spent many years of my life wearing my other hat at the Goodman Project, pushing this "not weak, just human" hashtag. And so I like it. And I just think it's really all about reframing what all this is. And I think in terms of best practices, like, there's pressure on all of us. When you're young, there's a lot of pressure. When you're older, there's different pressure. And wherever we are in our life, I think we have to have a culture that doesn't encourage, which is many people's natural inclination, including myself. And now I hear Ed, so thank you for sharing that, of just like sucking it down and just soldiering on through, because it's really not good for anyone, including clients. And so I'm going to turn it over to Lisa to take us home. But in the last couple of slides, I talked about the culture. There's also individual practices. I know Ed spent, some time going through these, and I thought that was great. Here's some other stuff, right? These like so-called soft skills, to me, turn out to be, it's like very eye-opening that these turn out to be super duper important. Setting boundaries. I'm still a work in progress. Like, these types of things are super important. And I think, we can be more aware of ourselves, be more aware of our colleagues, and by doing that, kind of create a culture where it's okay to seek help. And I think that improves us. And there are things that we can do every day, mindfulness, meditation. I used to be one of those men who was like, that's not for me. But I think that a lot of this is about reframing the way we think and giving ourselves space to just deal with stuff rather than burying it. And I think that's healthier on an individual level and on a work level. So I'll leave you with this and then turn it over to Lisa.
Great. Well, thank you, Mike. That was really fantastic. My name is Lisa Mueller. I'm also a patent attorney. We seem to have the trifecta of patent attorneys. Don't think that mental health and well-being issues are just isolated to patent lawyers.